Romance is the original genre of prose stories in English. And whether they're the ancient, wild, improbable ones or the more believable modern ones, not one of them claims to be factual. Romance might have a connection to the real in its presentation of the human condition or using details from the real world, but it does not invite fact-checking. So how do we understand a story that does claim to show something real? Well, unlike Once Upon a Time in a Land Far Away, history says things about specific times and specific places. These are stories of real people and real events using objective facts, information that's verifiable because it comes from somewhere, primary sources that can be documented and footnoted. But not everything can be known about the past. Think about what your grandchildren could possibly know about you. Your thoughts, your feelings, your secrets. How are those to be transmitted through history? And not everything in the real world could possibly be included in something written. We could have a data dump of every last detail from the real world, and it would still need to be sorted through to be made sense of. History needs shape to be comprehensible, and that is the task of a storyteller. There's selection of details, even if they are facts, and there's an arrangement into the shape of a story by stringing together those facts into something coherent. So what is the shape of a story about something in history? Well, it is generally an attempt to account for causal relationships between the past and the present. That's the big assumption that we make when we look at history. And the story form is analeptic in the sense that we are sitting in the present and we are trying to stitch together the past through hindsight to figure out an answer to understanding the present. Now, this is not the way we live life. We go from thing to thing to thing without knowing how it's going to turn out. But when we're writing history, we know how things have turned out. And so we're looking to the past to stitch it together causally to the present. It's kind of like how you can look at your own life. Here you are, the person you are now, and when you are telling your life story, you tend to look to the past and string together what made you who you are today. Well, it's the same kind of thing that we do with history. We look to the past for exactly those things that can be stitched together to make sense of our present. Another thing that can muddy the waters a little bit is that the victors do tell the stories. Which documents survive, which things that we can connect back to as far as primary sources and artifacts and that sort of thing, which of those survives into the present day that we can actually use to stitch together. Another element in writing history is that there's an objective narrator that is removed from the past by time and place. But the narrator selects this story. Well, why this story? And why is it to be told in this particular way? We have the idea of true objectivity, but there are motivations involved, both by the person who is writing the history and in the people that are being written about that nobody could possibly know about. Their internal workings that cannot be handed down through time. So as an example, I'd like to give you the writer who invented history as a genre, and that was Edward Gibbon, who in 1776 published a very ambitious multi-volume story called The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And he was talking about the story of Rome in 300 BC, but from an 18th century perspective. And it is pretty clear that here he was part of the British Empire looking back on the Roman Empire and trying to figure out what was it about the Roman Empire that they did wrong that made them fall. So what he's looking at here and what he's assuming is that there was some kind of logical progression over time, some kind of social evolution that would answer that question. Now, in romance, of course, there's a sense of arbitrariness. Things just happened and there was fate, but that is not this kind of story. This kind of story assumes, and it's every bit as much an assumption, that something causes something, and that's why we're here. And it is the storyteller who is picking out what those somethings are and making an implicit case that that was the causal root. And in so doing, breathing in the why to things happening. The what is already set. The what is something you can't go out of. These are the facts that button the story to the real world. These events happened at these times. These people existed. They were born. They died. But there is still the why things happened that the historian is bringing to the story. So in the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, we have the thesis that Gibbon is offering that Rome fell because there was a loss of civic duty. And that led to a loss of virtue among its citizens, and that made them weak. And he is making the implicit argument that Britain in the 18th century is on a similar track, but that it's prosperity that's making them weak. They share some things with the Roman Empire in that there were continuous wars still going on, and the people were taxed heavily to fund those wars. And the rulers, instead of being personally involved in these things, tended to just swan off to their country homes and entertain themselves without actually taking responsibility for the decisions that they were making. Now, when writing history, of course, you have to maintain fidelity to reality, and this is where the documentation is required. And Gibbon actually invented footnotes so that he could show you his paper trail from every fact that he offered. He could show you where he got that information, which really adds to the credibility of it being something that you can depend on. So let's take one of the stories that he tells, and that's about an emperor named Commodus. He succeeded his father, Marcus, in 180 AD, and he really did exist, and he had a beginning date and an end date. But instead of being a heroic character, which we would expect from a romance, he was presented as a fluctuating character. Now, in truth, no one knows what kind of character he was because no one knew him personally. And even if somebody knew him personally, different people might have different takes on what he was like. But Gibbon is offering us this sense of a character who was not born a certain way. He was weak. He wasn't a wicked person. He wasn't an evil person like he would be in a romance. He was just a fluctuating character, and he could have turned out either way. But over time, he made some bad decisions. And that, Gibbon theorizes, was reached a definitive crossroads when there was an attempt made on Commodus's life, an attempted assassination, and this turned Commodus very bitter. Well, how do you know bitter over this many years? This is the assumption of what happened to him because if he had been a heroic character, then his character would not have been corruptible. He would have had a heroic code. He would have kept to that code no matter what hardship happened to him. But instead, Commodus chose to become quite evil. And he went down what we would think as a road to ruin by the kinds of decisions that he made. He would stage gladiatorial fights and make it so that the fights were rigged, and eventually he would have to win and kill whatever the gladiator was that was challenging him, because it was known ahead of time that the emperor could get whatever he wanted, and he would rig these things, which does not make people like you very much. And in the end, his own guards killed him. So we have this history of Commodus that is offering an analeptic story in that it attempts to go back to the past to make sense of the present, both about Commodus's life, what kind of guy he was like that he brought on his own demise like that, and also what it was about Rome that those sorts of stories were happening into that led to its demise, and then whatever its connection might be to the contemporary time in Britain. In this way, story form shapes the reality, what happened in Commodus's life. Using facts and verifiable facts, Gibbon breathed in the why of things happening. What happened to Commodus to make him so bad? Well, nobody would know that, but Gibbon shows us a plausible and factual way that that could have happened. and he can draw significance from that. In our next webinar, we're going to take a look at what would happen if we had an historical story that made no claim to be real. There were no footnotes, there are no primary sources. It just shows a story in another time and mimics history, but actually bears no responsibility to being accurate. And we'll take a look at what that looks like.